What can you expect after a year of podcasting? This episode is going to be sharing all of the lessons, the wins, and also some food for thought on data that I've documented through my year of podcasting. I'm Anna Xavier. I'm the founder of the Podcast Space and a digital marketer for podcasters. This episode is going to have so many goodies, so make sure that you stay all the way until the end where I reveal some really interesting things that you can replicate to increase your podcast influence and also to grow your business. Let's dive in. Okay, before we get into the episode, I thought it would be interesting to share a few fun facts that have happened through this year. And so, how many episodes have I released in a year? This is episode number 55, and I have not missed any weeks because I couldn't do the episode. I pivoted, so I did some what you may call minimum viable podcast products. The 1 week I did miss was the week before Christmas and New Year, which, is historically known for having really low consumption data. And so I thought, well, there's no point releasing an episode there. So there was a strategic choice. It wasn't necessarily that life happened and can't release an episode. But this podcast is all about helping you create better strategies and streamline your processes, how to use your podcast as a better tool for your business. So of course, it would be weird if I missed it, but life can happen. All right, 80% of these episodes, of these 54, I'm not counting with this one, those were solo episodes, and then 20% were interviews. And I thought it was really funny because when I started the podcast, I remember thinking, I will probably do a few solos. Well, a few more than that. Only 20% of those were interviews. And then even though the podcast is video, only 30% of those were filmed with makeup on. And this one is with makeup as well. But I wanted to make a point of so many women that I have worked with in my past as a podcast producer in a studio, or women that I've worked with in a virtual setting. They all told me Anna, I cannot get into video because, I have to get my makeup done and I have to get my hair done. And I feel like I lose momentum. So it's either batching or nothing. And I wanted to kind of really embody what I'm saying. So if I'm saying, hey, you don't need to put makeup on to have a successful podcast and connect with people and grow your business through your show, I have to do what I preach, right? So I thought it was really interesting. So many conversations came out of that statement that I made a few times. And so many of you said, you know what? I'm going to show up even not just on my podcast because it isn't video, but I'm going to show up on social media with less makeup or no makeup at all. So I was very happy about that. Also, if you don't know me, let me give you a little bit of context. So I am a podcast strategist and marketer. And so I help small business owners use the podcast as a way to get into their business goals. And a lot of that includes streamlining their tools, streamlining their processes, because most people overcomplicated, right? And so to me, I feel like I couldn't create a podcast that is like all the bells and whistles and have a product that is really high end, which I used to do. I was a podcast producer. I work in a studio and I would have the really slick transitions for people. I was the one running the camera, setting up the lights. But when I launched my own podcast, I thought I really wanted to be a product that can be replicated and is very attainable and practical, right? So my camera plugs in directly to my computer. My microphone plugs in directly into my computer. 1 year on, it's still the same setup that I have. Funny enough, this is version 2 because I recorded it yesterday and I was not happy with the way that it looked. My script, what I talked about, I was like, you know what? This is a great first draft. And so here I am recording the episode on the day that is supposed to be aired, still coming out, but it was one of those decisions that I had to make. And so the motto of this podcast is create imperfect content that moves you forward. And sometimes the imperfect, it's too imperfect. And so we have to redo it. And, just every now and again, it's fine to do it like that. Apart from that, I wanted to make sure that this podcast was also through the almost like a beginner's mindset. The way that I crafted this podcast was I'm not using what my peers are using. I'm using the script. I decided to consciously make a lot of decisions not based off what expert in editing in video podcasting would do, like what I did. I used Adobe Premiere when I was working for other people. But now I'm using the script because as a small business owner, just one, didn't bring me joy, and two, I don't like Adobe Premiere. So a lot of this show is also to help you make decisions about which tools you can use and to break through a lot of the limiting beliefs they may be experiencing. I'm going to also be talking about the goals that I had right before we get into the wins. And so definitely like breaking down, I'm going to put a graphic here. So basically, initially, when I first launched the podcast, I thought that surely I'm going to be using the podcast about 30% as a tool to warm up the leads, to work with me, to buy my online courses, to book me as a consultant, to book me as a guest speaker. And then 25%, I thought it was going to be educational and experimental content for both, like social media, but also like for the podcast as well. 20% thought leadership, breaking down my expertise, and 15% for YouTube and SEO, so kind of like long-term impact, and 10% networking with decision makers. Now, obviously, a year on, looking back, I see that like a lot has not been the case at all. A lot of these goals were set for, immediate, medium, and long-term impact. So some of these I know that I'm not going to see the impact, and it's fine. A lot of the content that I released has been for a long-term impact. So I'm fine with that. And then looking into the percentages that actually happened. 5% actually, not 30%. That's the percentage that I felt was most accurate in warming up leads to get to work with me. And I'm going to talk a little more on the wins on that. And then in terms of educational and experimentation content, instead of 20%, it ended up being more like 40%. So actually, I experimented, shared a lot more about that than I expected. I experimented with RSS newsletters. I experimented with green screen on the script. I also tested a lot of consumption data. I was just digging in. And so I felt like a lot of the data that I was being able to understand, like from the beginning to end. And again, as a podcast expert that worked with business owners before, I was not able to see, like beginning to end, the actual process and what clients were doing. Like it was always like, hey, I've done this in this limited scope or vision of what was going on, right? Like I couldn't really see what was going on apart from the processes I was setting up. So to be able to control like beginning to end was really important to me, so that I could ethically talk about it. And then in terms of thought leadership, kind of weaves in with educational and experimentation process, because again, if you don't have expertise, you cannot like frame this quote unquote experiment that you're doing. So it ended up being more like 35% instead of 20. And yeah, like again, I experimented with a lot of things and I got to talk a lot about numbers in a exciting way, which was awesome. A lot of you are looking at your podcast analytics better now because of that, the content that I released through the podcast. And then 15% YouTube and SEO ended up being more like 10%. I'd say half the year was definitely experimentation on SEO. And then YouTube came out with podcasts and YouTube RSS feeds. So basically, a lot of that has changed. And then 10% networking, I'd say it definitely allowed me to talk to a lot of industry peers that I would not have been able to approach so far. And that happened not only through the experimentation, but also a lot of the content that I was putting out intentionally to reach out to those people. So there was a lot of thinking through this. Again, you have to understand that not everything that you will create will necessarily go the way you expect it, and that's fine. And that's what I always tell clients. You have to have your big picture, right? Your intention, your goals to work toward, but you have to be willing to pivot. And one of the things that I did was halfway through the year, I pivoted from the podcast being almost like a discovery tool and just not discovery tool as in I don't expect the podcast to be where people find me, but to discover more about me. So basically learning, going through what we call the funnel, right? Like from discovery to warming up to become a lead to the sales. So when you're looking at a marketing funnel, just warming up people to either work with me more or just be top of mind as a brand whenever they need podcast help. So halfway through, I decided to pivot the podcast to become a tool for a lot of the work that I was doing. So I incorporated coaching into my programs. And so the podcast pivoted to become more a support for those clients. So instead of creating, one example is the episode was the 3 scripting techniques that will help you get better inflection, be more confident, and make less mistakes, because I really documented and explained how clients can better use those techniques that I've used in the past as a journalist, to really create a script that one, honestly, like just is easier to read, because a lot of people have like a really chunky script. And so basically your eyes are looking through it and it's like, oh my God, there's so much text. Panic. So definitely that can happen. So again, like that was that pivot, and it's fine. As long as you say, okay, this is actually benefiting my business in a specific way, it's fine. Let's finally get into the wins, the celebration. So number one, and I feel like some people are going to roll their eyes, but to me, this was so important to showcase as number one. I tell you constantly that you have to have fun. You have to enjoy your podcast, because if you don't, if the reason why you're doing the podcast is to copy whatever so-and-so competitor is doing, it's not going to work for you, right? Because it's going to feel out of alignment. You're going to feel like an imposter all the time, and you may feel like there's no ideas coming through. So one important thing that I wanted to do was to have fun, experimenting with concepts, trying new styles, and sharing my expertise for longer than 90 seconds, which is, mainly what I had been doing on social media plus my website. And again, I prefer talking than having to write a bunch of stuff. So I felt like it was a really, really awesome win, especially because in the past I was a radio host. I had been a producer and a co-host for many people. So basically, like, I wasn't on camera all the time, and it's a skill set that you got to learn. And I was so stressed out because I was like, I know it's not going to be easy. And I feel like I love doing video right now. Again, there's a lot of insecurities. I have strabismus, which is when, there's a misalignment of one of your eyes. And I always felt super self-aware, especially because I worked for a little bit on television, and we had to do this kind of like live tests to see, could you be like the TV host in the news? And it was so terrible. It went terrible. And I just remember being told, like, yeah, your eyes are not going to work. So yeah, like we don't know where you're looking at. So this was early in my career. I was like 21. And so I felt like, I can never do video. And this podcast now, like after a year of doing video podcasts, and it's a different skill set, I definitely feel like whenever I have to like look at the camera, think about what I need to say, it's definitely different. But it's a challenge that I really embraced, and I'm so glad I did, especially because video will be the future of podcasting, especially because of YouTube. So I'm so glad I started, because now this year when, YouTube is pushing podcasts a lot more and video podcasts, I feel like I'm already comfortable doing this. So if you haven't, honestly, challenge yourself to launch your podcast as video format and do something that like you don't have to have like multi-camera views, like you don't have to do any of that. Number two, growth in confidence as a solo host. Again, 80% of these podcasts has been solo episodes. So I definitely feel like I can talk about things in a more relaxed way. I still make a lot of mistakes. The amount of cuts that I make on these podcasts is still big, but again, there's that thing where if you're doing a live show and you're doing a recorded show, there's a lot of your brain that like plays in it, and then you basically like, it's fine, and you make a lot more mistakes. So I feel like being able to do all of these content, and again, some of these episodes were like 13 minutes long, like not a lot, but definitely felt like really, really confident as a solo host carrying a show by myself. And again, it also comes with having structure and being structured and having a format and experimenting with format. A lot of the things that I talk with hosts and clients who need consulting and figuring out, like, I know what I'm talking about, but it just feels like I'm not confident on camera or in front of the microphone. A lot of that has to do with just the format not being right for you, but also you not giving you and allowing yourself to experiment as a solo host and like honing in that. And the feedback has been amazing through the solo episodes, because again, you can't expect growing your intimacy with the listener if you're not willing to do that one-on-one time, right? Because again, if you are inviting guests on your podcast, you're hiding behind the guest a lot of times. And so, it's really important if you're using your podcast as a tool for your business to hone in that solo time with the listener. And then number 3, opportunities for speaking engagements and just overall like being hired by the podcast. I've recorded episodes on this before where, especially video podcasting, a lot of people who are doing, like they're organizing speaking engagements or who are looking for speakers, there's the 2 ways to get in, right? Like one, the way where you apply as a person and then they go and check your material. And number 2 is just to actually create content and being visible on other people's feeds. And I have been invited to be a speaker on podcast conferences because, again, this practice that happens week after week after week really helps you be visible, be, top of mind for people who are thinking about launching a conference or doing something that incorporates maybe like a moderator or that they need a guest speaker. I've done speaking engagements for small groups because of my podcast, because of also the guests that I invited on the podcast. They then hired me to be guest speakers on their programs. And so the guests that are in front of you have an opportunity to also be doing business with you, not just your audiences. All right, I was able to book 11 one-on-one calls with fans of the show. And so many people say, and I wish I could hear from my fans. I really wish I could get engagement. And I feel like I ask people for feedback and nothing happens. Now, obviously, like there's a little bit of a side note because I launched the podcast space as a company in 2020 and I only launched the podcast in 2023. And you can talk to people via DMs and get to know them a little bit like that. But like nothing beats meeting someone who is listening to your podcast every single week, who, is benefiting from your work. And one of the things that I talk about is how your podcast is your legacy, right? And I'm getting ahead of myself, but just being able to take those conversations further and see the impact of my work. Because again, I am here in my office talking to a camera. Like I'm talking to no one in a way, right? So to know that, asynchronously, I don't know how to say this word. So basically not at the same time. I feel like people have been able to tell me like, hey, this one thing they said on the podcast really stuck with me. So, you shared, and these are kind of like direct quotes of impact. So people share that they've been able to get over imposter syndrome and release solo episodes, which to me, it's such a massive win because I feel like every single small business owner, particularly female business owners and minorities, they really struggle with getting their voices out. They think like they're an imposter and they shouldn't be having, solo time in the broadcast, even though it's their show. It's ridiculous. But I hear it. I hear it. So number 2, you've shared how you've consistently been able to release episodes and haven't missed weeks because you've been listening about like the tips that I use and the strategy that I use on the minimum viable podcast products, less stressful, like instead of releasing 40-minute episode, you release a 13-minute episode or however it is, right? Like I've done that myself where I've released episodes that were audio only instead of video because I was out of town and tech issues happen, tech issues. And it always happens. So you were sharing that you've been able to release the solo episodes because of that. Also, you've been able to finally launch your show after listening to these podcasts for months, which makes me so happy because that's the thing that most people don't know. I would say probably like 20% of my audience is people who haven't launched a show, and you're almost like listening to the show to prepare as in air quotes because you'll never really be prepared. You can have the best practices, but also at the same time, like it just is what it is, right? Like you have to do it. Otherwise, you'll never get quote unquote ready. You can have the structure and best practices like episodes about titles and how to better title your podcast to get organic reach and all that, but still, All right, so number 5, I actually, as a win, I had an increase in align and warm leads from both my primary and my secondary audiences. And you're thinking, who is your secondary audience, Anna? Well, my primary audience is you, small business owner or entrepreneur, creative who wants to create a better world through your content or your business idea. You're looking to improve your podcast. My secondary audience is peers. And that has been such an awesome thing. I would say that about 30% of my consultant work has been paid by my peers. And I always share how you should create a podcast that is for your primary audience, right? Like the people who need your services and your products. But when you create a product that feels very authentic, is really easy to follow along, and you're not pretending to be someone else, you're attracting the people who are in your industry and look up to you. Maybe they're a few steps behind, but in reality, they're looking at your content and they're thinking, wow, like she's really explaining this in such an obvious way. And I may be using a lot of like complex words, or maybe I'm missing a lot of like obvious steps. And in a recent event, I was sharing this. Don't create a podcast that is like for your peers, because they're not going to pay you. Well, actually, I got paid by my peers. But that's not the norm, right? Like, that's not the norm. So I just say, if you do create a product that is super enticing and super amazing and magnetic, even your peers will pay you money. So, hey, good thing to know, right? I definitely thought it was a really interesting thing. So people found me through LinkedIn, through Instagram, also through a live session that I did with a podcast company. So all of this was awesome because, again, I tell you, as the podcast is a great tool to help people realize if they want to buy from you. And I had people ready on the call and they were like, all right, so what do you offer? Because I want to work with you. And I was like, yay, this is amazing. That actually, to be totally honest, that started happening more like on quarter 3 and 4 of the podcast being live. So yeah, basically the first, I would say probably 6 months, the people that actually came to me were already people who were following me on social media. And then, they listened to a few episodes, but they already had that relationship going. So I don't feel like it was exclusively done through the podcast. Oh, something really I feel had a really interesting impact is that even though only 16% of my audience came from Spotify, I got a lot of messages on Spotify, and a few people said, like Senda said, yes, I've heard about content pillars, but never in this context of a podcast. Really enjoyed this. Definitely one of my favorite episodes of the podcast thus far by Zach. Kristen said, great episode. Jeremy mentioned it was a fantastic episode. As always, she provides great information in a fun and energetic way. So this is one of the things that will happen when you create, again, hone in on your style, right? Like you really get to see the impact of your podcast. Be the expert you are, but be you, because that is going to be helping you get those listeners who are just like lukewarm to really warm or hot and ready to buy from you. And again, it takes time. Moving into number 6. The content has had a long shelf life, and so I feel like I've drastically reduced by 50 or 60% the amount of work that I'm doing on social media because I am diverting people to the podcast. So I definitely felt like, and again, this is a really interesting thing that I feel like is in between the wins and the lessons learned. This year has been definitely, and like, again, as a business, it has been one of the best years for me in terms of getting new community members, getting new clients, but also getting more visibility online. And I got a few people saying, hey, I actually found you through this YouTube video and I got to know you, and I listened to the show religiously. So again, for most people who feel like, oh, I don't want to spend as much time on social media, I actually used a lot of what was going on the podcast to really deepen the expertise with my social media followers. So as a business owner, when you're looking at where do you want to spend your time and where are you spending doing busy work and work that is actually impactful in your business, I feel like the podcast has definitely done that. And then number 7, play with data. I've been able to really track performance a bit better on all stages of the podcast, from like idea and conception to getting a client or the podcast being marketed out. So I played with a lot of ChatGPT tools, Instagram stories. I was able to do, like every other Monday, I did a analytics Monday where I would go into my dashboard, show the numbers and show, hey, like I've been marketing this podcast as you, a small business owner would. This is what has been, like not working. This is pretty much like give an overview of like why the data looks like it does. And so, if you had like a spike, and then I would say, okay, you know why I had a spike? Because I did some live events, and basically that brought me a lot of new listeners. Next month probably will dip a little because some people will listen and they're like, okay, I got what I needed, and then they move on. Or then I'll have like the people that like, it may be a little bit of a higher number, but it won't be as much because that I'm not counting with a lot of new listeners. So next, number 8, I got to talk to 4 of my top 10 dream guests for the year. Not all interviews have been released yet, so just saying. That's one of the things that when clients work with me, they go, how did you get so-and-so on your podcast? And I'm like, well, let me spill my secrets with you. So again, like looking through the strategy of building authority and also building a relationship ahead of pitching is super important. But like, what do you say on those emails? Like that is super, super important. And to me, I know some of these guests would say no or not yet. You just never know how life is. And people say, what is that law? Where like the 7 degrees of separation, right? Where you're supposed to be separated by 7 people between you and, anyone in the world. And I feel with podcasting is more like 2 or 3. I definitely think that there's always the potential, especially as podcasters, because we are in the limelight, to get introduced to our dream guests. And honestly, some of these people took a lot of follow-up, and it's fine. The interview happened. It was a great opportunity, but you can do it. You can cold pitch it. You can go through the route of the podcast doing it. I don't like saying the right way, but the way that it definitely feels more aligned for most people. So again, 4 of the top 10 dream guests, I feel like that's a win. Number 9, most of the episodes on Apple Podcasts have well over 70% consumption rate, which is really, really good. Some episodes even have a 293% consumption rate, which means that if someone listens to a podcast episode more than once, that's where it will go over 100%. And so, to have an average as that, it's pretty good for me. I actually talked just briefly touching on this. In the beginning of the year, in the first quarter, I was releasing a lot of podcast interviews, and I felt like my consumption data was going down. So I was like, you know what? I feel like I need to create shorter podcast episodes, just me and the listener, to build a little bit of trust. And so that definitely improved my consumption data, which I was, yes, all right, a bit more to talk about. And then number 10, I feel like this is a win because I wasn't necessarily planning for it. A lot of people, when they launch their podcast, they want to hit, let's say they're in the marketing category. They're on Apple's top 10, podcast in the US or whatever. And I didn't plan for any of this because, again, this doesn't say anything about your business goals. It doesn't mean anything about the success of your show. And there's also like a recipe to get this done. So it's not like it's any feat in a way. Obviously, like there's work involved, but there's a process to get there. So if you follow the process, you'll get the recipe, you'll get the cake. So kind of feel like it's just kind of like not something that most people should aim at. But again, if that is what, a milestone you want to share, and I share it as well, I think that's exciting because it means that, if you're not doing it on the launch and if you're doing it later, it means that your podcast is consistently hitting those charts because you're releasing good content that is getting traction and all of that. So I hit the charts in the charts, meaning like, especially Apple Podcasts, which is the majority of my listeners, where they live, where they consume podcasts, should I say. So basically the US, I peaked as in like the lowest position you can have. And by the way, charts in most countries, like they will only start tracking from 300 to below. And so in the US, in the marketing category, my podcast hit number 68. Now, why does this matter in, that you're not doing it like they are doing it just kind of like organically? It matters because looking especially at the marketing category, there's so many millionaires that have podcasts, that have big teams, and people that are like maybe not millionaires, but they have big teams that are executing all the work. I've been able to do that by myself, just me with my expertise, me, the editor, me, the talent, me, the social media manager, right? Like, and that's exciting because especially in the US, the marketing category is really, really competitive. So I thought it was a really nice thing. And then in Portugal, where I'm from, I got to position 4 on the marketing charts. Both things happened at the end of the year. By the way, one tool that you can use to track if a podcast is popular, if a podcast has longevity, is Listen Notes. And I'll leave the links in the show notes. So basically, when I launched, I was a top 10% global reach, which means, like from the over 3 million podcasts available out there and tracked by Listen Notes, podcast ranks in the top 10% of podcasts. So launched as a top 10% at the end of the year. And now a year on, I'm a top 5%. So, which is super neat. You can create content to do so many different things in your business, and maybe you don't care at all, but when you hit these milestones, it's just like a nice thing to have because you're not working toward them, but you're still getting that. Let's move into the 5 things that surprised me, disappointed me, or taught me a lesson, because I feel like there's no such thing as fails. There's only lessons. So, under no particular order, number 1, slow growth on YouTube, even using shorts. I was quite disappointed because I've used this before with other clients to increase their audience on YouTube, and we got mixed results. And in the beginning of the year, I definitely pushed the shorts strategy, which is you release a lot of clips on YouTube, and the way that short form content works on YouTube is that like you're pushing short form, and then because they're only in one platform, they're more likely to subscribe to your show. What I felt, though, was that, I actually got a lot of hate. And not saying, a lot of hate, but, I would get really passive-aggressive messages and comments, so I just disabled those on the videos, on the clips. And it was quite disappointing because, especially those were videos where, I was like, this is actually good stuff. So a little disappointing on that. But yeah, I felt like there was definitely slow growth. Of course, YouTube podcasts being more prominent in their content strategy on YouTube. And again, knowing that 2 billion people are on YouTube, you definitely have to have your podcast there. But I felt like even other podcasters that I follow, they don't necessarily have a big growth. And I kind of was a little okay, maybe this isn't the platform for me. And so I'm looking at it from, again, one of those long-term growth where I know that in a few years, I'll definitely reap the benefits. But yeah, just felt like it wasn't as fast as I expected. I only have 113 subscribers on YouTube. But again, the priority is to create content for audio only. The video is kind of a nice to have because it's long-term impact. And then number 2, I was severely burnt out in January. And so when I launched the podcast, I was already burnt out. So I feel like this almost should be part of a win because even though I was severely burnt out, I was still able to release content every single week. I feel like what I was disappointed about was that I did a lot of more minimum viable product podcasts than I expected. So whether those were, maybe a video that I didn't prepare thoroughly on, and maybe it was just me kind of telling you my expertise. Some of these episodes definitely felt like I just wish I didn't get as burnout and I was able to find better ways to podcast, but it's the finding the ways to do it. And even though I just thought it was interesting, I still got a bunch of new listeners. I still got clients out of the podcast. So again, definitely tying in with the second one, which is doctors make the worst patients. I ended up spending so many evenings, Tuesday nights, at 8 and 10 p.m. still editing the podcast. It's funny because some people that I talked to, some of my listeners, they said, oh my gosh, I'm sure you have the whole year mapped out. And I was like, actually, no, I don't. That's a strategy where you're doing a combination of having pre-recorded content, having your business goals, but pivoting with a bit of the social listening, which is to track what is being said online, what the world is sharing. So basically, there was a period of time where people were talking about being severely burnt out. So that was an episode that I knew I was going to be releasing, how to create content if you're feeling burnt out, if you're feeling like there's a lot going on and you still want to deliver content to your listeners. So that was an episode that I had planned. I just pulled it to that time. So I did a lot more of that than I expected. And so also I was like, I'm just going to be, 2 hours, honey. 3 hours later, I'm still editing. That was a little disappointing, but a lesson that I always tell clients, hey, do a high quality but like lower effort kind of content. And I still did that, and it still felt like I was doing a lot. So definitely gave me a lot of compassion. If I was a producer, I was not researching or I was not doing a bunch of other things. So it gave me a lot of compassion and understanding for what small business owners that I work with truly face when they do the whole process. So definitely that was a lesson. And then number 4, I had a lot of initial anxiety over interviewing people. And after not having done it consistently, again, like, it's true about the use it or lose it, because I felt like I had so much anxiety over interviewing, something that I used to do a lot. And especially like English is not my first language. So I feel like I also get stressed out over that. And that was something that I was not expecting, but definitely I am a bit better now. And again, a lot of the anxiety was over, these limiting beliefs that I'm like, you are a journalist, you should be interviewing people in this way and that way. And it's like, no, I am not coming at this from a journalist perspective. I'm coming at this from, it's a podcast, it's a little different. Sure. Also, ethics from journalism school are still present. Interview techniques that I could use are still there. But at the same time, I was like, no, I want this to be more of a conversation, right? So I felt like that was something that I was not expecting. And sometimes it's more about like the expectations that we put on ourselves. So if you experience anxiety over interviewing guests, totally normal. And then last, number 5, I was not expecting how exhausting video podcast could be. As I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, I had to re-record the podcast because, again, I felt like this was an episode that I wanted to record in the daylight, and nighttime my camera doesn't do as well. So I had a vision for what these podcasts would look like. And doing a video podcast does require a lot of more mental bandwidth, requires a lot of more investment, emotional and time investment. Editing time. I have recorded a podcast episode where I'm talking about 15 considerations that you need to look into when you're thinking about creating a video podcast. But again, a year on, I'm so glad that I did it because I feel much more confident getting in front of the camera and recording myself. And so that has definitely helped, but it is a quite exhausting task in comparison with audio podcasting. And, that is something that I kind of knew was coming just because from like the journey itself of learning, but at the same time, just I have to think about the lights. And then actually for another disclaimer, again, I love being transparent on this show. So behind me, if you're listening to this episode, you may not realize, so go and watch the video. But I have my neon sign, I have my shelf underneath, which is, like where I keep my books, my notebooks, and then my grandfather's tape recorder, which it doesn't work. And I'm so bummed that it doesn't. But anyway, so I have that behind me. And in my mind, I was like, I want to have a little CT that I want to like put behind me and kind of like be chill and having a glass of water, not wine, and, like talk through the numbers and talk about these things, and ended up like not being at all like that because I couldn't get the angle to work. Because this is my house, this is obviously like not necessarily like a studio. So it ended up not like, the CT is really, really low and the angles just look really weird. So I was like, the sign, it was really tall in comparison with the CT. And I was just like, no, it's not gonna work. So I spent like an hour just trying to work through the angles. If it was an audio podcast, it didn't matter. So again, lessons learned. All right, looking quickly into data, which is the thing that, you're probably most curious about. So I want to start by talking quickly about the most popular episodes. So the most popular episodes, both on YouTube and audio only, they are the types of listeners and audiences that you can have on your podcast, the quickest way to determine if a podcast idea works for you, if an idea works for you. Is video podcasting for you? 7 goals you can set for your podcast. And then my first episode, Unlocking Content Strategy and My Journey in Podcasting. Now, they were pretty consistent on both ends, on both video and audio. And the one difference is that actually on the audio, I have a popular interview, which is with Nick Redman, How to Sound Like the Real You. Other than that, these were all episodes that were based off my expertise. And so takeaways from the most popular episodes. So number 5, people care about beginner and mid-level content. So definitely, if that's something that you've been thinking about creating, there is a demand for it. And then you can take people into like the mid-level to expert level. But there's definitely a huge craving for the beginner. So just on SEO, it's really important for discovery that you make sure that you get your content available on a Google search. And then number 4, episodes launched early are still people's favorites. These episodes, and then again, that's the value of creating a podcast that have like a long shelf life and they're not time sensitive. So all of these episodes were episodes that were mostly released in my first quarter of the podcast and second quarter. And then number 3, lists and how-tos are popular. I title a lot of my content, How to, 5 Things You Need. So basically those, if you haven't been titling your episodes like that, by the way, I have an episode on how to title your podcast episodes. Also listen to that. I'll include the links in the show notes. And then number 2, solos were very popular, but also because they were 80% of my catalog. So of course they had to be popular. A good reminder that if you have an imposter syndrome, and I just did this with a client, we were looking at the most popular episodes within the last 90 days. And pretty much a lot of the episodes, I think top 10, she had like maybe 50% of those episodes were solos, and she was super surprised because in her mind she thought that the interviews would line up the top 10 because she had really amazing guests. And it was just a great reminder that yes, people want to hear from you. Number 1, guests with very engaged and big communities didn't necessarily make a difference in podcast discovery. So basically I had really, again, some of these have not been released yet, but I release always like I just finished talking to so-and-so, oh my gosh, like, go and check out the podcast, or whatever, for when the episode's released. I feel like that didn't, again, because obviously like only 20% were interviews, but still some of these people that I interviewed had over 100,000 followers on social media. And I knew that having a big following doesn't mean that you will get a big jump in new listeners. So it was a really good reminder that checks out. Where I did get a lot of new listeners was through podcast guesting. So guesting on other podcast producers' podcast, or people who work in marketing or who do podcasts about live streaming. So that actually was where I got consistent growth. And then looking into downloads. So YouTube, as I said, I didn't see a lot of growth, 113 subscribers, 1.8 thousand views, and about 90 hours of watch time. So it's okay, not a lot, but it's fine. Again, long term. And then on audio only episodes, I had over 2,000, or actually should just say 2,238 unique listeners until today, and then 769 in the past 90 days. In the past month, just about 260. So again, a reminder that some months will fluctuate. And when we're looking, I almost didn't want to cover downloads because in August, when I took my sabbatical, I had it's not a bot attack, but it's like bots came and played my podcast. And the way that I know this, you should listen to that podcast, by the way, I had a 1,200% increase in downloads while I was taking my sabbatical. I was like, what is going on? And basically what happened was, like you can pay for someone to boost your downloads. And this is totally like me guessing. So you know how you receive 1,200 emails almost every month about people like, hey, I can get you on the podcast charts of whatever. I can get you 1,000 unique listeners on your podcast. Just pay me, like $100 or whatever. So people do that. And I'm guessing that has been done to quote unquote cover their tracks. They do across like multiple people. I don't know. This may sound ridiculous, but like the reality is I had every single episode being played about the same amount of times. And the second note that that is bots, not real people, is because we're playing the podcast on a Windows device using iTunes. Rarely anyone uses iTunes. So that completely skewed my data. Super mad about that. So, I have around 4,000 again, and this is where the around, because I can't quantify per se the amount of all-time downloads because of that, but I'm guessing about half is fake of what I have right now. So instead of having 8,781 downloads, I have probably around like 4,500, around that. So in the last 90 days, though, that is more accurate, about 1,200 downloads. And then in the last 28 days, I had about 400 downloads. And again, all of that fluctuates with how much effort are you putting in marketing yourself to new audiences, both online and offline. So I was just like, the podcast pivoted from being, a tool for discovery to just a tool for my business and for current clients. So I'm not surprised it kind of like slowed down. And then I looked at, I'm not going to get into this because, again, I backed that data from Spotify and Apple. And so it was really interesting because I love my podcast hosting platform. It's Captivate. By the way, I'm also an affiliate and I'll leave the link below. But Captivate does have one of the best built podcast analytics. And it's just, again, because it has a unique listeners and the downloads, you can really track if you had 100 downloads and 100 listeners. It's very different if you had 100 downloads and 20 listeners, which means people are consuming a lot more of your podcast catalog, which means that they're more ready to buy from you. So looking through any more data that I wanted to talk about, well, Apple comes first with my community. As I said, about 52% is coming from Apple, and then Spotify about 16%, and Chrome, so basically using their browser to consume content, around 11%. And then everything else is like itty bitty small podcast platforms. One of the reasons for that is that because my SEO is pretty good, people are coming through the website for organic search. And so basically they find the podcast and they play the podcast within the browser. So I think that's all about the year in podcasting. I definitely felt like, again, it has been worth it. It has been a lot more than I expected, even as someone who has done their first podcast back in 2008 while learning, at journalism school, and then doing it for a hobby or for a project or for a portfolio to apply for a new job. Basically, I've done podcasting in many different ways, and this was the first one that I did as a podcast expert. So definitely has been a learning curve for me because, again, not only doing it as an expert, because we all feel like imposters really, and it's hard to just fight those on the daily, but also to do it as a small business owner and looking at through your lens and experimenting with it. So it has been definitely quite a joy. Just lastly, at the end, I would like to mention some of the people that mentioned some of their favorite moments on Instagram. I asked you to comment those. So Vidya said, "Congratulations, Anna. Love to learn from all of your episodes, but the ones which offer a detailed insight on how to improve your podcast and how to learn from your podcast stats." So basically, those were her favorites. And then Zach, the podcast man, "I love how your pod has a mix of insight and thought leadership, but then also just nitty-gritty action items too. Episode 50 is my favorite so far." Awesome. So then Tasha, the therapy tea with Tash gosh, it's hard to read. It says, "I love your accent and how well you explain things." And then Rita said, "Congratulations. I'm also about to do 1 year of podcasting. That's awesome." And then Epitome by Alana shared, "This is amazing. Congratulations on, the year of podcasting." So I love that you got to share your takeaways with me. This is the obvious part of the podcast where I say, talk to me on Instagram, continue sharing your ahas. It's been awesome. Just hearing your private messages, your voice messages, telling me where, your little wins. I just love hearing those. And if you want help on your podcast, if you want to create a product that helps you and you're not feeling slave to the podcast gods, let's work together on growing, streamlining your podcast, becoming a thought leader in your industry, and really working through those limiting beliefs. You already are an authority, and to become and embody that authority that you are. As you've heard on this whole lengthy podcast episode, there are ways to generate interest in a podcast that you can create and feels exciting to you, and you don't have to replicate what other people are doing. So if so, get in touch with me at thepodcastspace.com. Drop me a message there, and I would love to work with you. I am so so ready to help more impact-driven entrepreneurs reach their podcast goals and really become more visible online. So hoping that you get and reach out. I'll leave a link in the show notes as well on how to book a discovery call with me. And yeah, just keep creating content that's imperfect and moves you forward. And let's carry on doing a lengthier and bigger and better year of podcasting in 2024. I'll talk to you in the next episode.